So one thing that I want to do to kind of set up the conversation, usually in a Veritas forum, we have a dialogue between people who have different perspectives. And we're going to do things a little bit differently tonight because, in a way, Molly's been having a dialogue with herself for the last couple of years. And so what we want to do is kind of walk through that dialogue, and Molly and I have kind of a conversation about kind of the perspective that she had, how she started to have a conversation with herself about that perspective, and kind of where she's come to now at this point. So Molly, I'm really excited to sit here and talk with a fellow historian tonight. So can you tell us a little bit about just kind of your background, set up a little bit for us your background and kind of how you viewed the world growing up kind of to when you went to graduate school?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you the nutshell version, but first let me just say I'm so happy you're all here, and I'm happy to be here, and I ask for your grace as I'm still really kind of stumbling through articulating a lot of these things to myself and making sense of what happened and figuring out my own mind. So this is kind of all a work in progress, and that'll probably be clear. I grew up in a suburban town outside of Chicago in Illinois, in a totally secular home where religion just wasn't really much a part of my horizon. I went to university, I took a lot of history courses, philosophy courses, and in my classes, I was increasingly coming to the realization that for a huge swath of human beings, religion was this, if not the primary, then an awfully important way in which they were understanding the world. And so just to be a better student, I needed to be learning something about religion. And then at the same time, I was meeting a wider range of people than I'd ever met before, including people who came from some sort of devout religious community, whether it was Jewish or Christian or otherwise. And I found myself envious of what they had, both the sense of strong identity that at least was what they projected, and also the fact that they had answers, or at least tools for grappling with the ultimate questions. They didn't just have to sort of stare dumbly into the void, which I guess I was just starting to do. And so I think I gravitated toward the academic study of religion as a way of sidling up alongside this thing that I was really kind of personally curious about, but I didn't really have any way in through maybe a conventional religious community. I did some very amateur ethnographic field work with a community of Russian Orthodox believers called Old Believers in rural Canada for a summer after my sophomore year. And that was my first experience of really trying to get as close as possible to the ultimately inaccessible, shadow of another person's worldview. It's very different from your own, and I just really fell in love with trying to do that, and decided I wanted to be a journalist of some kind focused on religion. I went to graduate school, learned a lot about mostly the American religion in kind of the contemporary context, made a kind of incompetent effort to get myself churched at one point, but just wasn't able even intellectually to get myself to theism, let alone the whole story of Jesus. So while I went to church for a time, it didn't take, I guess you could say. And to fast forward to a couple of years ago, I would say I was in a state of apathetic but vaguely dissatisfied agnosticism, just sort of a sense that I wasn't really happy being an agnostic. It didn't seem, the fence sitting of it didn't seem ultimately sustainable for the long term. And I thought, well, eventually I'll get my act together and maybe I'll become a Catholic or an Anglican. I always had a heart for the Orthodox tradition, but I wasn't really working on it as a problem. I was continuing doing my thing of being the kind of sympathetic outsider, writing mostly about religious communities, but very much on the outside.
So if you had this kind of sense when you first started being introduced to communities that wow, they have, answers and they feel confident in that. At that time, where were you going for answers? Or were you just kind of pretending like some of the deep, meaningful questions of life didn't exist and just kind of trying to live day to day?
I think I was mostly in sponge mode when I was an undergraduate, just trying, the task of just kind of surviving your classes and doing the reading was occupied 97% of my brain, and so there was maybe 3% left over. And I don't know that I was, but looking back, I was clearly searching at a personal level if I wasn't always articulating it. I mean, I was working on every part of my worldview. I mean, I really didn't know what I thought about anything, any major sort of political or philosophical question. And so I think I was doing a lot of trying on ideas. Mm-hmm. I had to write a paper in one class in which the assignment was in 5 pages to explain your political philosophy. And I went into it thinking, I have no idea what my political philosophy is. And through that exercise of reflection, I realized that my philosophy was contrarianism, which I credited to my younger brother, to growing up with a brother 3 years younger than me. And I had clarity in that I always knew whatever he thought about something, I thought the opposite. And so I took that with me to college. And so I sort of had a skeptical, if I detected anything that seemed to be sort of the popular view, I was a little bit dubious about it. But too much of too focused on my class and classes and interested in getting sucked into whatever worldview was like right in front of me and the novel I was reading or what have you, to be doing sustained work on my own ideas.
Did you at that time kind of believe that truth is relative, and so all the different religions I'm encountering might be equally valid? And from a lot of approach that we have in academics, we like to talk about kind of constructing ideas and how ideas are constructed and how worldviews are constructed. Is that kind of how you approached it?
Certainly, by the time I got to graduate school and I was getting a little more sophisticated in how I was thinking about religion, I think I was seeing world religions as different ways of asking and answering the same sets of questions. I don't think I ever was attracted to total cultural relativism. And I persisted in some level of confidence, as I kind of learned more about intellectual history and was clearer in my own mind that, well, I'm not a believer at this time. Maybe I would love it if all of that is true, all of those lovely stories about what happens after death and so forth. That's all great, but I'm not there now. And so my worldview, I guess, is secular agnosticism. So what are my philosophical resources? And I became sort of provisionally persuaded that the thinkers of the 18th century Enlightenment period who tried to sort of engineer a basis for universal moral claims without the help of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that they came up with something that was basically workable, and so I could kind of stand on that and not slide into total relativism, even if I couldn't get to theism, let alone any of the specific religious traditions I was studying.
I see. So when you got to graduate school, I think you told me that you had to take some Bible classes if you're wanting to, study religious history. You took some classes about the Bible, reading scripture. How did you approach studying the texts at that time? How were you trained to do that in graduate school?
It wasn't sort of a built-in part of the curriculum. I think a lot of people who come into the study of religion, often they have a personal relationship with the religious tradition they're studying, and so it's not maybe an area in which they feel a real lack, but certainly for me it was. So I cobbled together classes. I needed a very introductory survey of the Hebrew Bible, for example, and I really needed to take the undergraduate class. I was not prepared for a graduate level course on Jewish scripture. So I worked out a relationship with that teacher where I took the undergraduate class, but then I did longer papers and a little more reading and stuff like that. And I did a similar introductory level course at the Divinity School in New Testament. And I think I was not exposed in a direct way in terms of sort of didactic teaching from the lectern to any deeply radical biblical criticism. I think to the extent that I can reconstruct it now, it's been a while. I think I was taught to think about scripture in a sort of moderate, what is in secular academia, mainstream, historical, biblical, critical way that really sets aside questions of metaphysics and faith commitments, and tries to sort of articulate, what do the texts say, what are some of the working theories of authorship. I think, though, that looking back on this, I picked up from, am I making that noise?
No,
or
that's what I was trying to figure out.
Okay.
Is it me?
I picked up sort of from the ether. So I can't identify. I think the professors, certainly who were teaching at the divinity school at that time, the stuff we were reading, most of them, if not all of them, were sort of faithful Orthodox Christians. But I think I kind of picked up from the ether this, what I now see as a fairly out of date theory of New Testament studies that I would associate with sort of the radical Jesus seminar of the mid-20th century that really posits the Gospels as, this accretion of stories, at least their miraculous dimensions, around some basically inaccessible historical reality of a traveling, Jewish holy man. And there's a small amount that we can say with relative certainty about him, but so much of it is mythologized. And I think I just sort of picked that up. There's this way in which maybe growing up in a Christian, to some extent post-Christian culture, being at a secular university in that post-Christian culture, the Gospels, so many core Christian concepts become familiar without you ever actually learning them, ever actually studying them. And I think the actual experience of reading Scripture, I found it kind of intellectually engaging, but certainly it was work. It wasn't. I didn't have anything I could come close to calling a spiritual experience in reading these scriptures. Even though I think some part of my brain was trying to stay open to that, wanting to have that.
And I like how you talk about. I think there's some kind of cultural osmosis that, we don't recognize as happening in any age. That's one of the things that historians love, is that we can trace across time how there's these kind of generalized ideas in a culture that seems to kind of define that age, and that everybody seems to operate by, even if they have other differences. And you're right, I think in the mid-20th century and after, there's just kind of this widespread sense of, we can't really know the historical accuracy of the Gospels. These are later things that people added on, and people don't know where they got that idea. It's just kind of a common assumption.
And I think there's been a real shift in New Testament studies, kind of countervailing corrective to that in kind of the late 20th century, early 21st century. But I was clueless about that at the time.
Yeah. So, and we'll get to in a minute how she kind of came to hear about this alternative view. So that's sort of where you were when you became a professor. So when did things start to change for you?
Things got interesting 2 years ago. I've continued to do journalism alongside my work as a professor as much as I can. So I was working on a magazine article about a local Southern Baptist megachurch and its pastor, who had recently been president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So I pitched this story to my editor as sort of a typical, let's use this church as a way into these broader culture war stories. It's going to be just a kind of, I thought I kind of had predicted what I would find interesting, what I would end up writing about. I did end up exploring some of those questions, but I had a 2-hour interview with the pastor, J.D. Greer, and after that interview, we struck up an email correspondence in which it slowly became clear to me, not slowly, after 2 or 3 emails, that I was being evangelized. And I had never, this is very odd to say because I spent my whole adult life studying Christians, interviewing Christians, talking to them in various contexts, and I had never really been evangelized in a kind of direct way before. And I found, to my surprise, that I had I had questions that I mean, it wasn't like I was sitting around mulling these questions thinking, I just need some pastor who will sit down with me and have patience. Not at all. I mean, because of course, I could have gone into any church and said, hey, would someone talk to me? And they would have been happy to. But it was all, coated in a layer of sort of epistemological inertia or something. But I started asking questions over email about the historical claims Christians make and why Christian claims about the miracles of the Gospels should be treated any differently than claims Mormons make or Muslims make and so forth. And he would often write back and say, that's a really interesting question. When in retrospect, I look at the questions I was asking, and they were junior varsity questions. They were just I'm sure they were questions he'd heard a zillion times, but he took them very seriously, and he would say, let me sort of get back to you, let me do some reading and ask this and that colleague over at the seminary, and then he would write back these very intense, hundreds and hundreds of words with citations, answers that were more compelling than I expected them to be, and I realized that there was just a lot more here that I needed to learn, and I said, well, I'm a professor, I like to read, can you just give me some homework? And so he suggested some books. So I spent the next few months doing this very intense reading in in a few streams. I was reading New Testament studies written by a lot of Anglicans. Like I think he had the insight that, this sort of, snobby university person, she would sort of fall for a biblical scholar if he has a British accent, she'll take him much more seriously. The Anglican evangelicals are like the secret weapon.
They are.
They can reach people like me in a way.
I think there's studies that have shown that people attribute a 20% increase in intelligence to people who have a British accent. But
I totally believe it.
But also, I've got to throw in here, because I've heard you say that, when he was putting together this reading list for you and thinking about it, he was consulting some pretty big name people about what he called your case. Is this correct?
It is. He said, I've talked to Tim Keller about your case. And it was very psychologically astute. It was very flattering, right? These two fancy pastors who are very busy, they're interested in compiling a reading list for me. I feel some obligation to sort of, be doing this and be into it. And he connected me with Keller, who very graciously, he was battling cancer at the time, but that man was a committed evangelist till his dying breath. And he met with me over Zoom and we emailed. And so I would have these sort of monthly conversations with JD, and then I would also have these Zoom dates with Tim. And you can imagine, one is, Baptist megachurch warlord type who's very, very direct. Every third or fourth conversation I had with JD would end with some kind of altar call. And then, Tim, this kind of urban Presbyterian who was much more relaxed. And I remember the first time I kind of laid out my story to him, and he said, I don't know, Molly, maybe this time you'll become a Christian, or maybe you'll just stall out again. I don't really know. But it was really helpful to have kind of both those kinds of conversations going on at the same time. I had scrambled to get that article written, because it's very awkward, right? To be trying to be the objective journalist, finishing a magazine article with some degree of sort of responsible distance from your subject while you're being evangelized. And frankly, I remember when he told me to get N.T. Wright's giant book on the Resurrection and the Son of God. And I remember feeling so weirdly excited when I put in the Amazon order. Could it be that there is a book that will convince me of this? I've never been so had that sort of sense of anticipation for a 900-page tome. I was continuing, to my surprise, to go to this megachurch, which ran contrary to my whole self-conception as a classy high church snob who's really into as much, so many clouds of incense that you can't see the altar was sort of my preference. But I think that God saw that I had to be humbled in a very specific way. That, I mean, I'd always thought of myself, and I think I was, in my journalism, pretty successful at being a sympathetic outsider, and I don't know, getting closer to being inside worldviews that are not my own than maybe some journalists, but still I had some real blinders on. And for me, the elaborate liturgy and connection to tradition that I think is such a welcome drink of water for some Christians who grow up in very non-liturgical, ahistorical traditions. For me, it had the opposite effect, I think. It gave me so much to think about. The average, high church Anglo-Catholic worship overwhelmed me with history of the English Reformation, that I could think about loads of things and focus on everything other than Jesus. And there's something about the very stripped down, megachurch, simple stanzas on the screen, very blood and guts Calvinist theology, but just sort of reduced to its essence. And honestly, the anonymity of a giant dark auditorium. Part of what kept me out of churches, part of why I did like the Anglicans, because they're very sort of chilly, and they wouldn't drag me to coffee hour and try to set me up with like someone's recently divorced son or whatever. But that megachurch anonymity, if it was a small Baptist church, that would have been a disaster for me, because just too many offers of friendship and no thank you. But I could sort of encounter it on my terms. I could go and kind of stand in back, and then if I was like really kind of had my nerve up, I could go in and check in with this pastor with whom I was developing a friendship. We'd talk about whatever book I was reading, and I was sort of keeping this journal, just trying to keep track of my thoughts. And I had been sort of softened up. I think I had an upwelling of questions because I had recently read, I think, C.S. Lewis's most underappreciated work of apologetics, and it's the Space Trilogy, his work of science fiction.
I am so excited there are people in the audience who went whoop, that other people besides, because we knew that Molly and Curry, who will be coming back on the stage, and I had read it, and we didn't know whether anyone else would have read it. So I wanted to pause on this, because Molly has talked about this in some of her podcasts, only she just said you were kind of prepped by you having read this, and then the moderators just moved on. And as a listener to the podcast, I was like, wait, I want to hear what she says about this, because these books are so interesting. So for those of you who haven't heard of or read these books, Molly, can you give just like a brief overview, or maybe you need to rest? I will give a brief overview, and she can jump in if there's. So the basic premise is C.S. Lewis wrote a fantasy space trilogy. For those of you who don't know who he is, he was an Oxford professor who was a medieval scholar, a medievalist, who also wrote a lot of Christian apologetics. He wrote the Narnia books, is how he's most known for today, I think, a book called Mere Christianity as well. But what he did was he envisioned, coming, from the perspective as a Christian, God and his son Jesus are sovereign over the whole universe. And so I want to write a space exploration on the idea that if you go into space, this is the area where there's no fall like there has been on Earth. And God is still sovereign over the rest of the universe. So the first book takes a linguist professor at a British university to Mars. And pretty quickly he figures out that there's no fall here. They have a relationship with a spiritual being, and there's not some of the, oppression, imperialism, things that was important in Lewis's day and still ours, to mar their experience. Then in the second book, we go to the creation of a new world. He's envisioning, I think it's Venus, having people just being created. And the main character is sent to Venus to see Satan attempt to seduce the Eve of that planet. And so he explores then this idea of the temptation, only what happens if Eve says, I don't have to listen to you. And then she has a much bigger struggle than that, but And then in the third book, it's set back on Earth, and it involves academics at a regional university who want to apply some of their theories about researching the best world and the best life, and then applying that to their world and managing and controlling people to create this kind of ideal society. But then it turns out that underneath that are darker forces. So did I miss anything major in my summary there?
That was a great, really efficient summary.
Okay, thank you. So what was it, what was it about this particular trilogy that made you stop and go, whoa? I think you put it to me in an email that it kind of opened your mind in a way to think about some things differently. So
yes. Well, and let me add one sort of prologue piece, which I think this was very artful how God worked this out. I have no interest in sci-fi ordinarily. It's just not something I read. But I had, just prior, that February, I had a long flight to give a talk at Westmont, the Christian college in Santa Barbara. And Dune was one of the film options. And so I watched it, Dune, #1, both on the way there and on the way back, and loved it. And was like, wow, good sci-fi is actually theological. And so then I went and got the Dune series, which is all about a false messiah. I mean, the first 2 volumes anyway. Read the first 2 volumes, realized, kind of ran out of gas, but realized I liked sci-fi. And then thought, okay, well, to be a responsible person who studies American religion, C.S. Lewis has such influence, I'll read the Space Trilogy. So there was like this, I had to be prepped for the Space Trilogy. I think the power of the Space Trilogy, the first 2 volumes especially, they de-familiarized concepts that had become just casual household furniture to me. I mean, I thought that I understood and had deeply considered the fall and sin. I thought I had kind of some sense of, the ways Christians thought about angels, and they were sort of decorative objects in the tradition, and not something that I really took that. I mean, I was sort of respectful of them, like as a scholar of traditions that believe in angels, but they were sort of familiar. They were like dolls or something when I think about how they functioned in my mind. And Lewis, especially because this was science fiction, so I went into it not knowing what to expect, but certainly I wasn't expecting, straight-on apologetics. I had been totally unmoved by mere Christianity. I think I went into the Space Trilogy with my guard down. I'm just reading an interesting story. But the way he imagines a world in which there was no fall, and the way he just, in such powerful, creative detail, renders these interactions between humans and the creatures of the planet that is Mars, and these sort of angelic figures, made me really stop and think about these concepts. The depiction of Satan in Perelandra is the most disturbing depiction of Satan, I think, in English literature.
I agree.
I mean, more so than Paradise Lost. It is the only depiction that has really ever kind of kept me up at night. And what he captures is, so, in Milton, there's a real sort of grandeur and a pathos to Satan. You almost are rooting for Satan, you feel for Satan. The Satan in Perelandra is horrifying in his banality.
Yes.
In a way that just sort of really got to me. And so
there's a scene where Satan in Perelandra, he tortures the character who's been sent by God to Perelandra, this scholar character, by just saying his name over and over and over and over, while he's also ripping the heads out of all the little animals on the planet. So just this brutal, petty violence for the sake of brutal, petty violence, and just little ways that he's trying to torture this person. I agree with you. It's incredibly disturbing.
And I think that hideous strength, which is the third volume, it's a very trenchant critique of secular academia. And of course, he was writing it about Oxford and Cambridge in the 1940s, but there are many dynamics that are essentially the same. And I mean, are maybe critiques that one could levy about any subculture. I mean, the way in which people adopt in an unthinking way fashionable ideas and make compromises they don't even realize they're making for social acceptance. But I think the way he draws the two secular, non-believing protagonists and shows them having these deep emotional reactions to evil without having the theological or even the language to sort of describe what they're reacting to and why they're reacting that way really resonated with me. And so there was this cumulative effect of needing to process this and not really having anyone to talk about it with. And that was right before I met JD and started doing this reading and digging into the claims of the Gospels. The other key intellectual intervention that I think made this intellectual process end much differently than anything I had attempted before was, I think, in the past, anytime you are coming at another worldview totally from the outside, any of the world religions, there are total worldviews that make all kinds of crazy claims by the standards of Enlightenment empiricism, right? So in the case of Christianity, it's not just the Jesus stuff. I mean, the Bibles are full of unbelievable claims. There's the idea of heaven and hell. There are the claims about the end times, the sexual ethic that's wildly out of sync with modern secular culture. It becomes paralyzing, so that even if you start to make like a little bit of headway, your curiosity is leading you a little bit on one question. If you pause and think, well, but wait a minute, if I go down this road, I got to deal with all that other crazy stuff at some point. It's too much. I can't do it. But this was the first time I understood, which this is how epiphanies work. This is how conversions work. On the other side of it, it seems obvious. It was not obvious to me at the time. But for the first time, I saw that I could focus on the resurrection and that Christianity is really unique in that it is a religion where everything stands or falls on this one claim about something that Christians believe happened in history. And I happen to be a historian. And it turned out, I was discovering in my reading, that the evidence was a lot more interesting than I'd realized. And it was all right there, right? Like, these books are not obscure books. But I just had never engaged with it.
So you've said that you kind of almost gave yourself a master's degree. You did so much reading that Tim Keller and J.D. Greear assigned you, and that you had this moment where you realized, okay, as a historian, this is the claim that Christians make. So as a historian, I'm now going to assess this claim. So what were kind of the key realizations that you had that started to make you think that the resurrection was possible and plausible?
The book that was most important for me was N.T. Wright's big book on the resurrection, although I had to, it is, even for a historian, it's really a slog. So I would constantly have to kind of pause and read a chapter that Tim Keller has in his book Reason for God on the resurrection, where he sort of summarizes N.T. Wright's whole argument so I could remind myself of the forest for the trees. That book is a very elaborate kind of layer after layer exploration of the views of the resurrection and the afterlife, both in the Greco-Roman pagan context in the first century and the spectrum of Jewish views. And he makes clear that whatever Jesus' disciples were hoping would happen, expecting would happen, the end of the gospel story and the resurrection appearances are so far outside the cultural lanes, the sort of range of cultural imaginative options, that one has to really take seriously the possibility that they did not confect these stories to support their beliefs, but rather they developed these beliefs to explain unbelievable things that actually happened. And part of the power of N.T. Wright's book is that, for me, is that it is such a slog, and that there's just this cumulative effect of the depth of detail that he explores that I found really compelling. I guess I had in the past accepted what I now think of as fairly lazy analogies between Jesus and other self-declared messiahs, other stories of God's descending and rising again to heaven. And once Wright and other scholars subjected these comparisons for me to more scrupulous analysis, I was persuaded that they weren't very good comparisons at all, and that the Jesus case is just incredibly strange. And this drove me into, I think, a new relationship with the Gospels. I was reading the Gospels over and over, and having a reaction. I'm still waiting for the mystical experience that I thought I would get, at some point, and nothing like that. The closest I have gotten to that is the experience of seeing for the first time the sheer strangeness of the things Jesus does, his interactions with people, especially the accounts of healing, and the strange details, the way every healing is a little bit different. Jesus meets each person on their own terms. And as much as I think I had a real sort of allergic reaction to that evangelical theme of, imagine yourself in the scriptures, put yourself in the place of these people. I did start to get tugged into the stories a little bit. There's a way in which, when you spend a lot of time reading primary sources, you develop a sort of sixth sense for what a source is, what category it belongs in. And I think this is one change that's happened in the New Testament scholarship. So, following the famous German scholar Rudolf Bultmann, in the early 20th century, there was, I think, a move toward talking about the Gospels really in the category of mythology. But the consensus has shifted, and I think this is fair to say even of non-believing historians, that the appropriate genre for them is really more Greco-Roman biography. But even then, if you go and you read Plutarch's Parallel Lives, or you read, say, Philostratus's biography of Apollonius of Tyana, who was a traveling Greek sort of magician, healer, who's in the first century was sometimes compared to Jesus. The character of those texts is so different. So the character of those texts is they're very polished. They're deeply embroidered. The authors have a real commitment to careful scene setting. There is a brutal roughness to the Gospels, especially Mark. Mark, I'd always kind of dismissed Mark as like the short one and was sort of boring, like least theological. Mark was the one that wrestled me to the ground. And it is the grittiness, the sense that this is not, honestly, it is not a great work of literature. It is a desperate author just trying to get on paper this bananas stuff that this author was much closer to than I had realized. And I became persuaded by the work of people like Richard Bauckham, who's another one of these Anglicans who can kind of speak to secular American snobs, that we need to distinguish between some sort of vague idea of oral tradition passing, from community to community and getting garbled along the way, and oral history, and that there are clues in the text that create not an airtight, but an awfully interesting and persuasive case that the gospel authors were quite close to the events they were describing, and possibly should be dated earlier than I had kind of come to believe. And so all of that, this was so important. I did not have to treat the Gospels as inerrant. All I had to start to do was to treat them with the same methods and the same kind of respect and questions as I would treat other historical sources. But for that to be possible for me, they had to be sort of de-familiarized.
Interesting. Yeah, it's, as a professional historian, what you described is how I feel about the Gospels, because when I bring the techniques that we have in our profession to them, I was telling Molly earlier, it drives me crazy when I just hear somebody casually say, well, there's so many things that don't exactly match across the 4 Gospels, and so that's why it shows that didn't really happen. And I'm like, okay, so then clearly we don't know that anything in history happened. Because as historians, we know when there's accounts of events, so like I'm a Civil War historian, there is not a single newspaper article and a single eyewitness to the Battle of Gettysburg that agree on the details of what happened at the battle. None of us question the battle, but we have to piece together a rough estimation of what we think happened based on accounts that don't add up. And so to me, and I think as a historian, I came to some things on my own that scholars who are much better than me at the New Testament, come to do as part of their apologetics. But it was just striking to me that, in one gospel, there's 2 thieves are both making fun of Jesus. In another gospel, one of them eventually turns to him and says, that's what I witnessed. They both have 2 thieves on either side of Jesus. Different witnesses are remembering different things that they saw. That to me made it more plausible, and made it read, as you said, more like a true attempt to write a biography than a formalized document. And little things like, the Gospels record that women were first there and that women are the key eyewitnesses in a culture that discounts the testimony of women. As a historian, when I would read a document like that, I would say, okay, now wait a minute, why are they if they're wanting to convince people of something that isn't true, would they put these witnesses as their first class? Look, these women were the witnesses. So just lots of questions, the way that I methodologically go through and ask questions of a source. If I do the same thing to the Gospels, I've always found them to be very compelling as historical documents.
And the women, their role is one part of the broader, absolute humiliating scandal of the whole end of the Gospels. And this is what N.T. Wright's picture of Jewish theology and culture really drove home to me in a way that I just had not assimilated before. That, no other movement that had believed in a self-declared Messiah had then seen that Messiah killed and declared him God. You would run away, right? Because the whole idea of the role of the Messiah in Jewish thought was that this would be the individual who would lead Israel to worldly victory, and then resurrection would kind of follow for everybody in the context of that victory. And so I think this helped me see how. I thought, as a historian, it had always been really an important part of my self-understanding that I approached people in the past with respect and with a sense of humility. But I think that there was a way in which that first task that we're called to as historians, to just really respect the chasm between them and me, it can easily slide into a kind of condescension, because you forget, in your quest to distance yourself from your subjects, you can dehumanize them a little bit and maybe reduce the complexity of their worldviews. And so worldviews in the first century were, of course, very different from ours, but no less complicated. And so there were clear ideas for these people about what was and was not possible. And they were not fools who would just sort of believe any crazy thing. And certainly they were clear on dead people remaining dead, right? And I think I had just not, I had not fully grappled with the radicalism of the gospel claims in the first century. Forget about now. For me, the big hurdle, and I think this is true of many scholars who spend their careers on this subject, if you don't already allow for the possibility of an open universe, if you are committed to an anti-supernaturalist understanding of reality, then any possible explanation of the empty tomb and Jesus' appearances to his followers is preferable to the Christian explanation, no matter how baroque and elaborate. And I had to come to grips with my own deep anti-supernaturalist bias. I could always sort of thought of myself as open to the claims of Christianity, but I mean, my whole existence was in this one epistemological groove, in this one kind of lane of approach. And there are good reasons why in the modern research university, in a secular university, certain questions are just ones we set aside and we focus on other questions. But there's a way in which, in doing that, one can just get so used to setting aside those questions that you forget about the presuppositions that are involved in ruling those questions out. And you can begin to think in this subconscious way that those questions are just foolish questions because your tools that you're allowed to use in your teaching and research are not aimed directly at them. I think also I had a kind of all or nothing view of the historical method. That if we define the historical method as drawing, our ability to draw analogies between our own experience of cause and effect in our own life and the way cause and effect works in the past. And we define a miracle as divine intervention, interruption in the normal order, the normal relationship between cause and effect, then yes, it's true that at the sort of singularity of the miracle, the historical method fails. So you can't prove, as you could in a lab, or even, to the extent that historians can prove things. You can't prove the resurrection. However, there's all sorts of context, and you can bring the historical method to bear in all kinds of really fruitful ways to the textual record, the archaeological record. You don't have to make the perfect the enemy of the good. And if you're willing to suspend your disbelief in the supernatural, then you can begin to investigate the historical context of Christians' claims about the empty tomb and the appearances of Christ that then get you to the point where you're still faced with a leap of faith, but it's no longer a wild leap in the dark. It's a well-researched, reasonable leap. And then you start to realize that you were always making a bit of a leap. And you just weren't acknowledged. This was true for me anyway, that I had paid, I think, lip service to the idea that, yes, as a secular agnostic person, I had unprovable presuppositions because we all do, no view from nowhere, blah, blah, blah. But I'd never truly looked that in the face and wrestled with it.
So did you have a moment where you're like, now I'm 100% sure the resurrection happened, and so I'm going to, so how sure did you have to be before you had this moment where you said, I think I believe this enough that I'm gonna confess Jesus and go get baptized? What was that moment, and how sure were you?
This whole time I was doing all of this reading, I was praying, I was going to church, reading the Gospels, the things that you're supposed to do. And I had this thought that it couldn't just be a process of reading enough footnotes, that there had to be some kind of, warm and fuzzy feeling or something. But it was just radio silence. I had conversations with a few Christians across different traditions, and they all said some version of the same thing. When I would say, I want the feeling. And they would say, well, Molly, it sounds like what you are asking for is the relationship of faith. And that it is a relationship, and you have to think about it as you might the process of getting to know a human friend. And yes, you can Google a person, you can ask around about them, find out what they're like, and sort of suss them out at a distance, but you can't actually become their friend and have the experience of the friendship until you risk something, until you actually enter the relationship. And it might go badly, you don't know, but you have to step out in trust. And that was persuasive to me. And I had some sense too that my apologetics reading, and it's still it's an addiction that I have to manage because I recognize that it is driven by a very kind of depraved desire to make God answer me on my terms. And I mean, I've read enough Eastern theology and the apophatic theology to be able to like discourse in a relatively intelligent way about the limits of, human description and blah, blah, blah. But it's so hard to actually put that into practice when you're a product, as I am, of a culture in which, your whole sort of educational and professional life, you set yourself out a task and you learn the stuff necessary to execute the task, and you execute the task and you move on. And I wanted, at some level, even though I knew it was absurd, I wanted Christianity to be like that, and it wouldn't submit to that. I thought of myself, and I still do, as having some kind of commitment to the pragmatist philosophical tradition associated with William James, and his whole idea is that truth is an asymptote. We can never get there perfectly. We can only kind of creep forward toward it, and we should hold our beliefs about the world lightly and treat them as tools to navigate the evidence we have. And as the evidence accumulates that maybe makes our tools seem inappropriate, we've got to be willing to change those tools, change our worldview as we gain new evidence. And I got to the point where I certainly was not 100% persuaded of the resurrection, but I was well north of 51%. And I thought, well, forget about what a Christian would do. I'm not a Christian, but I am trying to be a good William James style pragmatist. And in that case, I have to be willing to adjust my working hypothesis of the universe. And if I believe that it's more likely than not that this guy rose from the dead, then I can go with him on the other things he says about himself. And then I have to submit. Because part of what this is, part of getting anything like an answer to my question is not God giving me the answer, it's me submitting without knowing. And so that's how I found myself in the very strange position of being in that tank on the stage of this megachurch while the worship band was playing with a black Jesus in my place t-shirt, being baptized with a former president of the Southern Baptist Convention.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. So that was how long ago?
It will be 2 years ago in August.
Okay. So as kind of because I realize we're getting to where we need to do the Q&A. So you took that step where you said, I need to submit to this and I need to enter into a relationship and get to know and experience a back and forth potentially. What has the last 2 years kind of added? Has it been anything new in your intellectual experience since that moment in the tank?
I think, I am continually learning that much of the Christian life is about patience. And when I talk, if I manage to talk to a Christian for more than 10 minutes, I usually find a chance to grill the person on why they believe any of this stuff. And 9 times out of 10, they don't talk to me about investigating the resurrection. They talk to me about the work God has done in their life and how they look back over their life and they see these interventions that God has made. The way, American evangelicals talk, they say, God showed up in this or that way. And what this has communicated to me is that becoming a Christian who walks with some degree of confidence, the doubts never go away. That's the other thing that I see very clearly now. That Tim Keller's analogy is that they're just like every good, healthy immune system has antibodies in it. Every faith has doubts that are sort of there, and you just sort of live with them. But I've learned that it is through that sort of living as a Christian and learning to look for God and sort of see him in your life that you develop both that relationship and I think that abiding confidence that carries you through the periods where he seems to be totally absent. I think I'm at a disadvantage because I am really I study this evangelical history specifically, right? I'm almost like a scientist who has entered my own experiment. And it's really exciting, but it's also sort of, it's a liability because I will have sort of flashes where I'll have a reaction to scripture, or I will see something that in my old mindset I would have dismissed as a coincidence, but now I'm like, wait, what's happening here? But then I will immediately step outside myself and say, I'm being socialized by the lovely ladies in my Bible study, and I'm starting to think like a Christian. And I have to remind myself that we are all socialized to think in the lanes of our worldview. And I have to get away from the error of sort of reifying where I came from and treating this new thing as something I'm tricking myself into. But I accept that it's going to be a long process to get beyond my current spiritual infancy.
So the final question I want to ask you, we titled this, Micah actually at one point wanted to title this Veritas When Your Research Studies You, because I think of some of the things that you said, but we ended up titling it, Changing Your Mind. So how has changing your mind been kind of both unnerving and joyful? You mentioned to me in a conversation we had over Zoom that it was both for you. So if we're thinking about this theme of changing your mind, and if there are people who are kind of on the cusp of changing their mind, what's been kind of most unnerving, but what has also been the biggest joy for you in doing this shift?
Yeah, I became a Christian when I was 41, and I just thought, 41's not that old. My students think it's ancient, so does my daughter, but it's not that I thought of myself as sort of ancient, but I thought that, I don't know, I was basically settled. Like the big questions about who I was were more or less settled. And it's just tremendously exciting that might not be true. And that, as I now see it, that God can sort of drop these beautiful bombs in your life that you don't look for, and it's been incredibly intellectually stimulating. that's the mode I know how to operate in, and I'm slowly sort of developing my other muscles as a Christian. But for now, it's just opened up this whole world of reading and learning that is kind of adjacent to what I was doing and still do as a historian, but it is quite different. And these questions of, what is the warrant for belief? And why do people believe the things they do? And what is the right balance between preserving a respectful strangeness between ourselves and people who lived in the deep past, and also recognizing our common humanity? These are incredibly interesting questions. But the flip side of that is that, when you're in your early 40s, everyone in your life pretty much thinks they have you figured out. And so when you make a big change like this, it throws people for a loop. And I think too, in our cultural moment where we're so polarized, we're all guilty, I think, of kind of putting people in oversimplifying boxes. There's a particular cost to sort of the culture war connotations of the context in which I became a Christian. I wouldn't have chosen this particular church. I see now very clearly why God chose it this way. But it does mean that when I'm trying to explain myself to people who are, coming out of a more left-leaning secular context, the headline they see is Southern Baptist Convention, not Jesus. And it's hard to negotiate that. But part of why I decided to speak publicly about it is because I'm worried about intellectual diversity, especially in our universities. I'm worried about the very oversimplified ways we view each other in America. And I thought, well, gee, if I've had this experience where I'm now just a sort of weird person who doesn't fit neatly in these usual boxes, maybe it's helpful for me to talk about it.
Well, and it has been. And Curry, would you go ahead and come up on stage? Molly, I want to thank you so much, because I think one of the reasons that people enjoy your podcast and enjoy talking to you is because you're just willing to be honest about your thoughts, your doubts, the questions you ask yourself, willing to tell your story, and you bring out things I think that a lot of people are thinking, but not everyone is willing to say in a podcast or get up on a stage, and it's honest and courageous, and so we're very grateful.
I'm going to try and make all these questions both for Molly and for Lorien, because it's excellent that way. The first question that got upvoted the most was, how did your colleagues respond to your conversion? And I think this is an important question, because both of you, me included, we sort of have an in-betweenness. We're part of one guild that has assumptions about another guild, and we're part of that guild too that has assumptions about the other guild. So just talk about the experience of colleagues after conversion, and in particular, we don't know if you crossed paths with Bart Ehrman over at UNC ever, who is a noted New Testament scholar and a skeptic, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, Bart's a friend of mine. He's been very generous to me. And his books were incredibly helpful in my own process. But clearly, I came to different conclusions than he has. We had a very intense lunch where I explained to him what had happened to me, and I mean, he was very gracious, but it was intense, and we have different views on the legitimacy of applying the historical method to these questions. That's for sure. In general, it's not something that I go around I didn't knock on every colleague's door and, I'll damp for my baptism and tell them about it. I told, friends who are kind of close enough, I wanted to tell personally, I did, and then in other cases, I suppose there's a grapevine effect. I don't totally know because, I think people generally don't like conflict, and so people who had maybe a negative reaction aren't in my face for the most part. There have been a couple of colleagues who reacted very badly, and many who have just been really curious and supportive, and there's a bit of the, oh, I'm so glad you found your truth vibe sometimes. It's just the culture we live in. I have had to accept, as I have had these conversations with people, in my professional life, in my friend network, and in my family, that the reaction people have to my conversion, it does not have a whole lot to do with me. It has much more to do with that individual's personal history with religion, maybe with Christianity in particular, their relationship to our current political context, how they view religion fitting into that, and that I can't control that. And so I've tried as much as possible to just persist in being a normal person, just be normal Molly. Don't bring it up too much. Sometimes I have friends or family in the same room where I know one person loves to talk about these questions of ultimate concern, and the other finds them super weird. So I defer to the person who finds it too weird. I think you need a time of just reestablishing equilibrium before you push too hard on this. I'm not committed to being the personal dedicated evangelist of every person in my life, but I am committed to being transparent, especially with my immediate family. And that is sometimes awkward, but Christianity is like a whole set of deeply outrageous proposals. So, we should be ready for it to be a little bit awkward.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, next question, I'm getting down to them. You used the word de-familiarized a couple of times tonight. And why is it important to de-familiarize the Gospels for us to understand them well?
I think if you are growing up in a vaguely Christian context, you sort of encounter references and images, and certainly much of our vocabulary is still theological. So we still use words like evil and sin, even if we are not personally believers. I teach a class at UNC called Sin and Evil in Modern America, and the first assignment is I give them a list of bad things that can happen that range in severity from dropping your ice cream cone to mass murder. And I have the students go through and kind of label each one. Is it just a tragedy? Is it too bad? Or is it evil? And so often the upshot, the point of that exercise is to reveal to us sort of how much we still lean on theological terms as a crutch, even if we don't subscribe consciously to the worldview that produced them. But I think when you use words casually and you think the basic outlines of Christianity, you are pausing at a superficial level. And that was true. I mean, I'm very embarrassed that was true even of me as a professional historian of Christianity. I mean, I don't focus on the first century, but I think because I was sort of constantly reading theology and talking to people in these communities, I'd read scripture, I'd done the work in graduate school, but it was at a sort of comfortable remove. And there's a way in which you have to be willing to let the stories and the claims like impinge upon you in a sustained way, and that for that to sort of continue, for you to continue feeling it, you can't allow any of the callus to build up. And I think our post-Christian culture is one giant callus against the goads of the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can I throw in something? I don't know if this is the same as de-familiarizing, but I think the other thing that happens is we have so many things in our culture that are kind of taken from Christianity broadly that just kind of seeps into our subconsciousness, that sometimes even when you're someone who reads scripture a lot, sometimes you've heard the stories a lot, and so you're not paying that close attention, and you don't realize that things that actually aren't what's in there is what you're bringing to it. So, I mean, to me, I think about there's a lot of Christians who, what they think the Bible teaches is that when you die, your spirit goes to heaven and we're going to live in a spirit world. Mm-hmm. That isn't, at the end of Revelation, heaven comes down to earth, and there's a new heaven and a new earth, and we have spiritual bodies. But it's not, we're going to go off into but sometimes we think about it that way even when we know better, and we have to have a moment where we approach things with a fresh eye and we say, what is it that's really in here versus the assumptions?
Yeah, that's really well said. This is a connected question for both of you. But Molly, you mentioned cultural osmosis a couple of times, taking things in by cultural osmosis. And I'm wondering if you have a take on certain things that especially students are picking up by cultural osmosis in 2024, certain beliefs or presuppositions that are uncritically held or that could stand to be, for us to have them de-familiarized, I guess.
I think the assumption that all religions basically work the same way is one that is very widely held. And it has been, I think, for more than just the sort of most recent period of time. I think it's been a feature of our culture for the past couple of generations. And I think I thought in that lane until very recently, when I really, and this comes back to the point about de-familiarizing basic Christian concepts. I think when I really tried to reckon with for the first time in a deeper, personally relevant way, the idea of salvation by grace, which I think is, it's the heart of the gospel. It's also the thing that probably the majority of Christians on a daily basis drift the furthest from. I did begin to appreciate it as a radically different approach to, diagnosing human nature and God's relationship to humans than that what is on offer in other worldviews. I think too, this vague idea that, Christianity, like other supernatural worldviews, was, very kind of acceptable and normal in ancient times, and then it's only now that its basic claims are crazy, is also one that should be exploded. Now, it was scandalous for a different set of reasons, to ancient Romans than it is to our culture, but it has always been outrageous. And so the pressure that Christians feel to give up the pieces of Christianity that seem outrageous, that is a pressure that Christians in every period probably felt or ought to have felt if they didn't. And I suppose the broad thing that I struggled with the most is a naturalist view of the universe. And my next kind of big research endeavor after I got to a point with the resurrection where I could become a Christian was to really do a lot of reading and interviewing on contemporary claims of miraculous healing around the world. And that was an area where my mind was just blown open. And I really had to come to terms with the blinkers that I had walked around with and my totally casual dismissal of what is often shockingly compelling testimony, often coming from people with fancy degrees who, are in my kind of milieu, who I had no choice but to listen to and ask, boy, maybe I'm really wrong about how this universe works. But our grooves are just so deep. I mean, this is why it was really important for me to keep a journal when I was reading these books on apologetics and on miracles, because if I didn't write down my kind of reluctant piecemeal conclusions, my brain would move on from them because they were just too hard. I had to continually reread my own journal entries to really come to grips with it. Okay, when I reasoned through this is kind of where I got, and I've got to face that.
I want to piggyback real quick on something you said about we get in our, the miracles. One of the things that's always struck me about historians in our profession, so we study, say, the First Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening, these times of big revival in American history. And we have all of these sources. For example, where I think about, there was a young woman named Mercy Wheeler in a Puritan town in the 18th century who was born lame, and during a revival, she prayed and she was able to walk. Everybody in the town testifies that she was born lame, and everybody testifies that she could walk. And what strikes me about that is we have all of this evidence from this community, and we have all these historians who look at that, and they never once say, could this woman have really been healed? They just dismiss this as a piece of evidence. That there could be something more than a natural explanation for things.
Or don't they limit themselves to saying, well, this is how these claims were understood in this community. And I wrestle with this. I do think it's appropriate for there to be certain categories of questions and methods that we use and others that we sort of put to the side. But I do think it's important when I teach the First Great Awakening. That's one of the points in my course where I will pause and say, let me lay out for you the kind of materialist socioeconomic context that some historians think is helpful for understanding why this community was primed for this experience. But let me also tell you how what the believing perspective would be. And I always try to stress to students that the two are not mutually exclusive. And so many, maybe the majority of the best historians in the subfield of American Christian history are themselves confessing Christians of some kind. So the worldviews are compatible. But I guess it's in the habit of constantly leaving those questions out and constantly putting on the kid gloves and putting them in a box. It's in that habit that certain assumptions develop that rule that world out in a way that is not necessarily entailed in respecting a certain set of limitations on the methods of modern secular history.
Wow. Yeah, that's fantastic. So the next question is about your book, Apostles of Reason, which at the risk of embarrassing Molly, that is a fantastic book. If anyone is interested in the history of evangelicalism in America, for a fair account of that movement, especially on the intellectual side, it is a great, great book. So in that book, you discuss how evangelicals try to navigate the waters of secular reason and scientific knowledge and faith. And this questioner wants to know if you could mention a key issue that is still seen as problematic or unsettled within the community of faith that is evangelicals. And your thoughts, given your historical understanding, on how to best navigate that sort of thing.
Oh, wow.
Big question.
Big points to whoever asked a specific question about a book I wrote 10 years ago. Wow, that's awesome. I think that it is both the great kind of genius and gift of American evangelicalism, as well as its persistent bane, that it is so decentralized and has such vigorous and sort of centrifugal arguments about authority. I mean, unlike Catholicism or the Mormon Church, to some extent the liberal mainline, which I think is sort of defers to the university establishment as its magisterium, evangelicals don't do that. And I do think that they persist in a commitment to what is a fantasy of unmediated access to the one fixed meaning of Scripture that is impossible to achieve because we are all historical creatures who we can never get pure access, right? We are humans trying to access revelation through a set of texts that were themselves created by flawed humans. Even if you believe in inerrancy, that has certain implications. So I mean, there's almost no issue that I wouldn't put in that category. I mean, I think some of the tried and true ones, even though they've sort of fallen off the culture wars radar, are still pretty live. I mean, I still have conversations with students about how to reconcile young Earth creationist views that they may have grown up with in their church with the stuff that they're learning about evolution in their pre-med courses at UNC. And I think that there's still a sort of broader, that speaks to what is a deeper and broader problem, and that is the pronounced distrust of secular experts across the board, across many areas. I think we saw this especially during COVID. And I think the reasons for that are complicated, and I would never suggest a narrative that places all blame for the kind of credibility collapse on conservative evangelicals. But I think that conservative evangelicals had a sort of head start on some of the anti-elitist, anti-expert trends that have gotten accelerated in the internet era. Because going back into the mid-19th century, evangelicals responded to the rise of modern biblical criticism by saying, we have to reject the arguments that these German scholars are making, not because we've really closely evaluated the arguments, but because we believe that the arguments are motivated by atheistic presuppositions. Mm-hmm. Now, it is valuable and reasonable to wonder about and investigate the assumptions on which your interlocutor is arguing, but it can morph into an excuse to totally turn away from inconvenient evidence. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a kind of habit that humans have generally. Social scientists are constantly telling us about our confirmation bias, our motivated reasoning. This is how we have evolved. This is just how all humans are, regardless of how you happen to vote. But I think there are particular cultural reasons why this is a problem that evangelicals wrestle with in a pronounced way, and they will continue to wrestle with. But I think that the project of rebuilding that trust between especially universities and much of America broadly, not just conservative evangelicals, is one that is going to require a lot of work on the part of universities as well. And I'm trying to be a part of that at UNC. So it's not a black and white story by any means.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, excellent. We are at 8:30, and so I would like to invite you guys once again to thank our speakers for a wonderful conversation. Thank you guys so much.